All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Giuseppe, for the invitation. Thank you also to Olympia for helping to organize the visit. I'm really looking forward to these 3 days and having conversations with all of you and all of you online about these topics of norm psychology and how our new ways of thinking about norm psychology can be applied to non-human animals and maybe other places where we haven't normally thought to look for norm psychology. So I thought what I'd do for these 3 talks that I'm going to be giving in the next 3 days is start off with a big picture about what norm psychology is, and then dial down into smaller pictures. So today, the talk that I'm going to give you is work that I've done with Professor Evan Westra, who's at Purdue University. And it's based on a paper that we published in Biology and Philosophy with a similar title to this one, with some development on that. But largely, it's this general methodological claim that we want to make, that we need to start thinking about norm psychology differently from how it's typically been thought about in the literature in order to make progress on the kinds of questions that we have about how we are thinking about norms. All right. Tomorrow's talk then is going to be an application of this to the question of animals. And the next few days will be more about animals. This is mostly about human animals today. So we'll start there. All right. So Evan and I were thinking that we have a lot to learn from the moral psychology literature. Since the early 21st century, there's been a bit of a crisis in the field of moral psychology, both among philosophers and psychologists, because at this time, at the turn of the century, philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists have developed a number of different theories of, I'm going to just minimize this, I'm not looking at myself. A number of competing theories about the cognitive processes that produce moral judgments. And despite a shared sense that any successful theory should explain certain paradigmatic kinds of judgments, right? Everybody was interested in questions about trolley problems and that it's permissible to flip the switch in a trolley problem case, or that intentionally harming others are wrong, right? We could agree upon these cases, but the theorists struggled to characterize the boundaries of their subject matter. We had a hard time trying to identify what it is we were actually talking about, what counts as moral psychology. So, for example, some worries arose about whether there's a real distinction between moral and conventional reasoning, since in some cases, reasoning about paradigmatically moral transgressions, things like murder, looks quite conventional. Right? It's not something you have to think deeply about. We just have a conventional rule, don't murder people. But in other cases, reasoning about putatively conventional matters, like, for example, how to dress, what sort of clothes are appropriate, that reasoning looks moralistic and gets discussed in moralistic terms. So there are other related worries about the universality of the moral conventional domain across cultures, about the characterization about the moral domain in general as weird, right? Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, as opposed to something that might be seen in other cultures, non-weird cultures. So at the same time, we had these sorts of worries about moral conventional distinctions and universality across cultures. Worries also started to rise about the heterogeneous nature of the cognitive processes that were being identified in moral psychology. Right? These sorts of concerns prompted Stephen Stitch and others to doubt that the phrase moral cognition actually picked out a natural psychological kind at all. So the problem was twofold. On the one hand, it was unclear how to define the boundaries of moral cognition from other types of norm cognition. On the other hand, paradigmatic cases of moral cognition didn't seem to have all that much in common with one another, whether at the level of content or at the level of underlying processes. And this created kind of fuzziness. And this fuzziness, it didn't prevent moral psychologists from making important advances on specific questions in moral psychology, right? So if you were working on something like empathy or the nature of character and character traits, or a question just about self-control and self-regulation, we see progress in those very specific domains, but it wasn't clear how to work in these kinds of specific domains, what they had in common, and how they were, like the progress we were making in each of those domains were able to help us answer these questions about, right, whether there is a moral conventional distinction, what is universal about morality. And the borders of moral cognition seem to be determined more by the pragmatic interests of psychologists and philosophers who are asking the question than any real joints in nature. So we had a bit of a crisis here. And in response to this crisis, many researchers started to search for different ways to carve up this empirical territory. How can we think differently about these sorts of questions so we can make some real progress? And one promising avenue of research has been to shift focus from moral cognition to the psychology of social norms more generally. So this research project shifted attention towards the broader tendency to conform to and enforce social rules that dictate which behaviors are required, allowed, or forbidden for members of a given community. Norms construed this way might govern familiar moral domains concerning things like harm and fairness, while also regulating a much wider range of conventional activities. Things like rules about queuing for a bus or how to prepare food. While this approach leaves open the possibility that moral thinking might be empirically distinctive, it doesn't start out by assuming it. And actually, it wouldn't be a problem at all if this idea of a distinctively moral psychology turned out to be a largely weird, in the technical sense, phenomenon, right? Something that was a product of the West's peculiar history of normative institutions. Rather, the new cognitive science of norms takes heterogeneity and cross-cultural diversity in the contents of normative thinking as its starting point. So in this way, the new cognitive science of social norms has learned some lessons from moral psychology and hopefully is avoiding some of the problems. But Evan and I think it could learn more lessons. And one of the central goals of our work in this new growing program of research is to give an account of the mechanisms and processes that undergird our adherence to social norms. So there's been a lot of research trying to propose what these cognitive capacities look like. And on the slide here is just an example of some of the different proposals, things like social learning capacities that support a dual inheritance system, some kind of dedicated norm system, some intrinsic motivational processes, things like joint action or shared intentionality, perhaps domain general reinforcement learning or associative processes or prediction error minimization or model-based control, right? These are all the sorts of ideas that have been thrown out there as possible mechanisms that support norm following and norm having. And while many of these proposals are really plausible as an ingredient that supports social norms, Evan and I worry that there's something about this approach to the psychology of social norms that risks repeating exactly the same mistakes that we saw happening in the field of moral psychology. What we haven't learned, it seems, is that the mechanism supporting norm cognition might be more kludge than elegant machine, as Stephen Stitch described moral psychology. So instead, the most of the existing proposals in this area seem to begin from the tacit assumption that there is something cognitively or motivationally homogeneous or unified about the psychology of social norms, a discrete set of mechanisms or processes that underpin all forms of social norm acquisition, conformity, and enforcement. And so the main aim of this paper is to argue that this way of thinking about the cognitive science of social norms is wrong-headed. While it might make sense to treat community-level behavioral regularities that we explain in terms of social norms as a functional category, it's most likely not the product of a unified cognitive system or a homogeneous set of processes. The psychology of social norms, we argue, is pluralistic. So researchers, we're not the first to suggest that norms might be pluralistic, and researchers who are working in the psychology of social norms have recognized a few different forms of pluralism about norm psychology. So for example, in her Philosophy Compass article, Elizabeth O'Neill explicitly advocates for a pluralistic approach to the way that we classify social norms based on our pragmatic goals. And I'll have more to say about this in my third talk. Norm theorists have also been happy to accept a form of pluralism about the contents of social norms, acknowledging that normative cognition might govern an extremely wide array of social practices, from traffic laws to etiquette rules to models of how to be cool as a teenager in 2023, summer of 2023, more specifically. But this pluralism about the best way to classify norms and norm contents is belied by apparent assumptions about homogeneity at the level of cognitive mechanisms. So this is where this level of cognitive mechanisms is where we see the greatest need for a pluralistic perspective. And this kind of pluralism that we have in mind for the psychology of norms is modeled after the kind of pluralistic approaches I and others have developed about the nature of folk psychology or social cognition. So early approaches to folk psychology took it for granted that we come to understand the social world by predicting and explaining behavior in terms of propositional attitude attributions, right? In order to predict what someone's going to do next, we have to, for example, attribute to them a belief that something is the case, like there is the belief that there is beer in the refrigerator and the desire for beer, and putting together this belief and this desire with a theory about folk psychology, or by mentally simulating what I would do if I had that belief and desire, then I can predict what someone's going to do. And I do backwards prediction in order to explain why they did what they did. I think about their beliefs and their desires and the theory or the simulation that got them to the behavior. So it was all very much Hempelian scientific explanation, description of social cognition. And while this might be a nice way of thinking about how social cognition could be modeled, I think it has nothing to do with the mechanisms of social cognition. And so I argued in my book, Do Apes Read Minds, that there are a number of different cognitive mechanisms that support our ability to predict and explain behavior, including representing the situation and what one should do in the situation, so grounded in social norms already, and thinking about people's personality traits, character traits, thinking about stereotypes, and so on. Pluralists in folk psychology have also emphasized the importance of other regulative or mind-shaping processes that don't involve prediction or explanation at all, that we together create what we're going to do when we collaborate. But the key insight of pluralistic approaches to social cognition has been that understanding the social world is a messy, complex process. It doesn't look like a Hempelian deduction of scientific explanation at all. There are a variety of ways of doing social cognition, and it's not a question of do we simulate or do we use a theory, or is there some hybrid, but it's a lot. It's messier. And similarly, what we suggest here is there are many ways of doing social norms. So to defend this idea, first I'm going to offer a reformed conception of the explanatory goals of the cognitive science of social norms and how they should be studied. Then using this framework, I'm going to make clear, I'm going to make the case for a substantive psychological proposal about socially normative cognition, which we call empirical pluralism. Before concluding, I'll consider a few potential objections to the proposed framework and then look at very briefly a couple of consequences that I won't be following up on in the next two lectures, but there are more as well. All right, so the case for pluralism begins by asking, what does the cognitive science of social norm aim to explain, right? What is the explanandum? What's our question? One possible answer is that these theories are aiming to explain a kind of community-level social practice characterized by patterns of behavioral conformity maintained to some degree by social pressure or sanctions, normative regularities that are ubiquitous in everyday life, present in all human populations, and manifested across an extremely diverse set of behavioral domains, seen in everything from children's games to locations for defecation. So we might expect the cognitive science of social norms examines the psychological factors that contribute to the emergence, maintenance, and dissolution of these community-level normative regularities. However, many of the theories about the psychology of social norms are first and foremost concerned with explaining an individual-level psychological disposition that underlies the human tendency to learn, enforce, and comply with normative regularities. We can call these ought thoughts. So understood this way, the psychology of social norm is engaged in a kind of functional analysis, such that the primary goal of the psychology of social norms is to analyze ought thoughts into a number of better understood causal processes, because ought thoughts are thought to be what produces normative regularities. On such views, ought thoughts are also criterial. If a pattern of behavioral conformity and sanction is not driven by an ought thought, then it's not a real normative regularity and not part of the explananda for the cognitive science of norms. But a major challenge for the ought thought conception of the psychology of norms is that there's little consensus about what ought thoughts are. Instead, as already alluded to, different norm theorists define the core psychological properties of ought thoughts in a variety of ways, each focusing on a slightly different set of motivational, representational, or phenomenological features. And these differences in the initial characterization of ought thoughts are in turn reflected in the functional analyses offered by the different theories. Theories that understand ought thoughts in terms of rule-based representations posit structures dedicated to the storage and manipulation of these rules. Meanwhile, theories that focus on the affective dimensions of ought thoughts posit mechanisms that generate these affective responses. This reveals the fundamental problem with treating ought thoughts as the primary explanandum of the cognitive science of norm. As a psychological capacity, they're not well defined. There's no specific thing that this capacity enables us to do, no agreed upon behavioral or psychological signature of ought thoughts. In this respect, ought thoughts are quite unlike other well-known targets of functional analysis and cognitive science, things like belief attribution or the approximate number system, where the capacity in question is well defined, even though there's debate about how they should be functionally analyzed. In contrast, each theory of social norms characterizes ought thoughts in a slightly different way, and this is reflected in their functional analysis and in their choice of what even counts as a social norm. So ought thoughts here are posited as the primary explanation of normative regularities, a vast and variable set of phenomena encompassing all human communities and stretches back deep into the evolution of our species. This approach is unhelpful, to put it mildly, when we can't even use it to identify what counts as an ought thought without first understanding what the cognitive mechanisms are going to be. And so it's a non-starter, really, especially when you start asking questions about whether there are social norms in other species where you even can't get at what the cognitive systems would be. So we need to have a better way of understanding what the explanandum is, what is the phenomenon of interest that we were studying that we can all agree upon as theorists. Yeah. So the ought thoughts, I think I've already gone through this, yeah. So what we're arguing is that prioritizing the explanation of ought thoughts over the explanation of normative regularities get things inside out. In order to understand the cognitive underpinnings of social norms, we shouldn't start by stipulating a controversial psychological definition of ought thoughts, which we then use as a criterion for identifying normative regularities. Instead, the cognitive science of norms needs to begin with identifying the phenomenon of interest, which is a normative regularity. And this has been productive with pluralistic approach to folk psychology. We look at what's the phenomenon of interest? Are we interested in predicting, explaining behavior in folk psychology? Okay, yes, that's what we want to know. How do individuals do it? Well, there are lots of different ways. We can likewise in the investigation into social norms say what is the behavior associated with having social norms. And then we can uncover the cognitive mechanisms that produce those behaviors. So we think that the behaviors of interest are normative regularities, and these are best understood as a kind of functional category along the line of Daniel Dennett's real patterns. Identifying the real patterns that is a community's social norm is robustly predictive. It's recognizable without knowing the psychological mechanisms that cause humans to act in the way they need to for the pattern to emerge. And it offers a compact description of a large sets of behaviors that facilitates fluent social interaction. Following Dennett, once a real pattern has been identified, there's no deeper question about whether the community really has that social norm. The pattern is the social norm. And then we can ask, well, what are the cognitive mechanisms that support it? And whatever those cognitive mechanisms are going to be cognitive mechanisms that support social norms. Not the cognitive mechanisms, but just some, and perhaps just some in this particular case. We can go on then to investigate whether there are particular kinds of cases that different kinds of cognitive mechanisms support, but that's the project that comes later after we've started looking at a case-by-case basis of what are the mechanisms supporting this pattern of behavior. So to turn the study of social norms right side out, we offer this notion of normative regularity to characterize in theory neutral, minimally psychological terms the properties of the community level phenomenon, which the term social norm typically refers, and that social norm theorists take themselves to be explaining, and that is a normative regularity, which is on the slide, a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community. So just to unpack this normative regularity construct, patterns of behavioral conformity are an aspect of social norms that feature in almost all accounts of normative cognition, even those that adopt very different theories of cognitive architecture. This emphasis on real patterns of behavioral conformity distinguishes normative regularities from purely prescriptive norms that aren't widely adopted by a community and so have been manifested in any kind of concrete behavioral patterns. Obviously, it's possible for agents to represent prescriptive norms of this sort, or at least some agents, but this is a variety of thought which is more commonly associated with ethics than with social norms, or with other sort of cognitively sophisticated or intellectually advanced engagements with norms. And it's not going to typically be among the exponenda for the cognitive science of social norms, even for those who do understand social norms in psychological terms. Social norms, in the sense we're interested in, is thus has this really strong descriptive statistical component that captures what is done or the way we do things around here. So that's behavioral conformity. The second aspect of normative regularity I want to unpack is our notion of social maintenance. This aspect is intended to capture an element of norm psychology that's often framed in terms of punishment or punitive attitudes. The idea behind this is that social norms are not mere patterns of conformity, but patterns where conformity can be rewarded and non-conformity can be met with some sort of social pressure. So for example, the queue jumper might get a nasty look, while the left-handed door puller is barely noticed, even though these are both violations of statistical regularities. Queue jumping is a violation of a norm. Opening a door with the left hand is not a norm violation, at least arguably so. Maybe it is, we can talk. The pressure is what distinguishes normative regularities from purely statistical regularities. The former are patterns of statistically common behavior that are in some way enforced by agents upon one another. We'll have more to say about this in a little bit. But just to unpack the last aspect of a normative regularity is this notion of community. All we mean in this account is that a community picks out the population of individuals that are involved in the social maintenance of a pattern of behavioral conformity. Members of a community don't have to be physically present to influence norm conformity, particularly in a human case. They don't need to be geographically local or anything like that. Immigrants might conform to normative regularities in their native countries instead of adopting new norms because they're more strongly influenced by the social pressures from that community, for example. It's also important to recognize that individuals can be members of many different communities and subject to conflicting social pressures. Which community membership more strongly influences an individual's behavior may vary depending on the context, whether, say, they're cooking or doing writing papers for a university class. And figuring out an actor's relevant community is going to be part of the task for the cognitive science of social norms. For example, when we turn to apply this to animal social norms, what we would do is default to the scientist or biologist or ethologist's view of what counts as a community for that particular species, would be how it would be defined. All right, so with this framework in place, we're now in a position to fully articulate this central empirical thesis of empirical pluralism. And this is that social norm acquisition, conformity, and maintenance are the product of a variety of different underlying cognitive, affective, and ecological processes of varying degrees of complexity. The core argument for empirical pluralism is simple. Once we stop taking it for granted that thought picks out a discrete type of cognitive process or some kind of norm system, or that it refers to a natural psychological kind, and then instead turn to community level normative regularities, it becomes clear that the psychology of social norms can be realized by many different processes. I'll show next that what these processes have in common is not a unified cognitive architecture, but rather a shared causal role in sustaining community level normative regularities along the lines of social cognition more generally. So I'll do this by laying out in very broad terms the three main aspects of normative regularities that the cognitive science of social norms might aim to explain, which we model after the framework that Schropada and Stitch offered in 2006. We're interested in social norm acquisition, how individuals learn about the normative regularities in their community, social norm conformity, why individuals are motivated to adhere to these normative regularities, and social norm maintenance, how normative regularities are maintained by the behaviors of others in the community. And by turning to each of these three different elements, we see that already we've got pluralism for each of them, which makes pluralism for the whole shebang kind of overdetermined. So starting with norm acquisition, we can ask, how does a person come to learn the norms in their community such that they're able to conform to and enforce them? I can briefly mention 5 ways in which norms can be acquired, starting with cases that look the most like rule learning, and ending with cases in which representing a rule as such doesn't seem to be required at all. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive account of norm acquisition, but it's going to give you the kind of pluralism, the range of ways in which norms we think can be acquired, which will point to pluralism in methods of acquisition. So the most cognitively complex way of acquiring a norm would be through direct instruction or testimony. When somebody tells you, hey, this is the rule, this is what you need to do. This form of norm acquisition is, in the literature, I think sometimes passed over too quickly, particularly in accounts that draw analogies between normative and grammatical rules. Those sorts of accounts really stress the tacit, inarticulatable nature of normative knowledge, right? Just like the rules of grammar, we can't directly assert them often. Linguists need to extract them from us. That's true, of course, for some of our social norms, but others we do explicitly teach children or teach immigrants. Parents remind children to mind our manners, sign in the park remind us to pick up after our dogs. So at least some of the time norms are acquired via language, comprehension processes stored as linguistic representations and semantic memory, and activated in the form of explicitly articulated or mentally stimulated speech. Slightly less explicit, but still cognitively complex, some social norms are not directly taught, but are inferred via mentalizing, that is, inferring what one's supposed to do based on the normative expectations that we attribute to those around us. The best known theory of norm learning along these lines is probably that of Kristin and Cagliari, whose notion of social norms is explicitly grounded in belief attributions. We infer that a rule is a social norm and prefer to conform to it on our account, just in case that we see that, first of all, members in our reference network or our community conform to it, And secondly, that we see that others in our community believe that others in our community ought to conform to it as well. This is highly mentalistic. It requires a theory of mind, beliefs about our community members' beliefs. Slightly less sophisticated, but still inference via kind of mind reading would be Jordan Thoreau and colleagues' account of the sense of should, where people infer what they're supposed to do by mind reading what other agents expect that they'll do. So because that you can make predictions without attributing beliefs and desires, there's a way in which this kind of inference via mind reading might not require theory of mind in the sense of propositional attitude attribution, but would still require some sort of mind reading in terms of what others would approve of or disapprove of, their sorts of emotional or affective responses to your behaviors. So an example of this would be accidentally discovering the existence of a norm when you violate it. Perhaps when you're traveling somewhere and you do something like, oh, I don't know, take your shoes off and show the bottom of your foot to someone and they look at you in horror, or you try to say kiss a baby in Austria and the parent is so offended that you're trying to touch their infant. These are the sorts of ways in which we can infer that there was a norm there that we violated because of the responses of others. All right. Norm learning can also occur via social learning heuristics that don't obviously involve any mentalistic inference. Things like copy the majority or learn from prestigious individuals. This is familiar in the culture literature, both human culture literature and animal culture literature, that when you see these sorts of behaviors that are acquired and quasi-universal in a community, how are they acquired? They're acquired through social learning. There's also some evidence that in young children, there is this tendency to kind of ascribe a promiscuous normativity where they infer that what adults are doing is what is supposed to be done, and spontaneously enforcing these inferred rules upon others once they see adults behaving in this way. Right, so an adult puts all of the blue containers on this shelf, and then the child infers that's the way it ought to be done, just because an adult did it this way. This kind of promiscuous normativity heuristic might also be what drives young children to over-imitate intentionally performed but unnecessary actions. Right, so in these sorts of cases, children seem to be able to detect and correct violations of norms, even if they can't verbally articulate it, they can't tell you what the rule is, but they can protest, no, not that way, not this way. It's unlikely at this age, because the children can be very young before they've got a robust theory of mind, that they're doing anything like attributing beliefs or desires, and so on at this case. And reinforcement learning is another form of tacit learning that can happen through simple domain general mechanisms. Social rewards and punishment can be construed as intrinsically rewarding or aversive responses from members of a community, which can come in the shape of facial expressions, gesture, vocalizations, touch, and so on. So a simple example of this is when you get on an escalator in a busy train station. Should you walk or should you stand still, or where should you stand on an escalator? It might seem like the value of these choices are relatively the same. You know, the amount of time you save by walking is equivalent to the amount of energy saved by standing still, so you choose at random. But of course, if others around you are walking and you're standing still, then this is a kind of a reinforcement for you to move along with everybody else. It facilitates the move and ease of achieving the goal with the people around you. And so you associate a higher value to walking over standing still. So this kind of strategy doesn't require any kind of representation of agents' mental states or normative beliefs. You're not thinking about what the other people on the escalator think or anything along those lines. It's more like a stored map of the reward structure of this kind of social environment. And this sort of training doesn't require any kind of representations about agents' mental states in general either. You just kind of know, it's a kind of a know-how of what to do in these different sorts of situations. And partially having to do with structures in the environment. I'll say a little bit more about that too. The last way I want to talk about norm acquisition is through biological inheritance. This is something that is also often not discussed in the discussions of social norms because it's, I think, largely, the focus is largely on kinds of social norms that are socially acquired. But social norms don't need to be socially acquired, they could be biologically inherited as well. So think of pro-social norms like the care of immature infants or cooperation with group members or reconciliation after fights. These might be part of our biological inheritance, and because they're seen in lots of different species, and they seem to be pretty automatically expressed in humans across cultures as well. So there are different norms that are developed about infant care, right? How do you care for an infant? Something that's socially learned. That you care for an infant is not necessarily something that is socially learned, but could be biologically inherited. Another example of a norm that might be biologically inherited would be a prohibition against incest. It's something that, again, we see in lots of different species and often is described as being part of our biological inheritance. But of course, if you violate it, you violated a social norm, and there's a lot of social maintenance that supports individuals, encourages individuals not to engage in incest behaviors. Like the app in Iceland that lets you know how closely related you are to other members of the community who you might be dating. So this is a non-exhaustive survey, but it's already exhausting, I think, just describing the different ways in which we can acquire norms. And when you see that it's social learning or biological inheritance, you already see that there's going to be different cognitive capacities that are going to be required in these different sorts of methods. I think I don't need to belabor that anymore. So then turning to the question of norm conformity, what is it that once you've acquired the norm makes you conform to the norm? We also see lots of different mechanisms that could be involved in norm conformity. So many suggest that conformity comes from intrinsic motivation, that a fully internalized norm just is primitively motivating. If you really have internalized the norm, then you will follow it, you want to follow it, and that you want to follow it regardless of the kinds of costs or benefits that would accrue from following it. While there are some compelling accounts of how this property of social norms might emerge from more basic computational and biological processes, such as the allostatic maintenance of metabolic resources by minimizing prediction errors or model-free reinforcement learning processes, from the perspective of methodological pluralism, intrinsic motivations are not going to be a defining feature of normative regularities. We think the difference in motivation to follow norms is just as important to investigate. And widening the scope of our inquiry in this way gives us the opportunity to understand not just what different normative regularities have in common, but how and why adherence to them might vary. So different norms in one culture, we might follow more strictly or more loosely. And of course, we know that there's strict and loose, tight and loose norm cultures across different communities in the world, and also personality differences about how strongly you follow norms or not. So I think that this idea of norms being intrinsically motivating is something we need to set aside, and that there are going to be degrees of motivation to follow norms. And this is just an empirical matter of observation already. I mean, it's a decision whether you want to call these norms or not. I think that not calling these things norms because people aren't following them consistently would be a real mistake. So one of the most obvious non-intrinsic motivations to conform to normative regularity is to avoid punishment. After all, punitive practices are widely viewed as key components of the psychology of norms, and it's well established that third-party punishment can stabilize all kinds of social behaviors, regardless of their immediate individual costs. Besides fear of third-party punishment or second-party punishment, norm conformity might also be sustained via the fear of ostracism. The failure to comply with the norm affects partner choice decisions of members of their community. In general, if the risks of punishment outweigh the benefits of not conforming to the norm, we should expect widespread norm conformity. And this cost-benefit calculation could be explicit or they could be implicit in the learning process. It doesn't mean that you need to, work through it individually at a personal level or anything like that. Alternatively, individuals might find that social norm conformity confers a variety of rewards or benefits. These might come in the form of material rewards if abiding to the norm in question is just a solution to a coordination problem that allows us to achieve our end goals. So for example, in North America, we often abide by the norm of walking on the right side of a stairway because it's so much easier to get to the top of steps by conforming to the behavior of everybody else walking on the steps, rather than fighting against the current people. The convention could have been just as easily walk on the left, but we conform and walk on the right because following the norm is an effective means of achieving our goal. So in these sorts of cases, the best explanation for norm conformity is that following the norm is the most straightforward way to get what you want. It gives you a social reward. There are other ways of getting social rewards, like when we play by the rules in a game, we get to play the game with another person. So we're doing something together. We've got the shared intentionality, engage in, we behaviors that are of value to individuals. We also might, by following social norms, we might feel a really intense form of community. So for example, if we conform to the norms of our soccer team, our football team, by all wearing the same t-shirts or jerseys or whatever they're called when you go to see the soccer match, and then you all feel like you're on the same team. And that's a social benefit that you have as well. There's also environmental scaffolding that encourages individuals to conform to norms. So the example that Evan and I like to use, and I think that some of the examples that Giuseppe and Marco you use in your papers have to do with the way that the environment is constructed or engineered by people who want to encourage certain kinds of norm conformity. So the example Evan and I use is a ski hill where there's a norm against going out of bounds. You want to stay on the runs, you want to avoid the forest. Skiers are sticking to the designated runs because if you ski out of bounds, you might get in trouble, ski patrol might come after you, might get a dirty look, but you also are not going to end up at the bottom of the lift. You might have to trudge through deep snow. You're not going to end up at the chalet where you can get a nice warm drink, or so on and so forth. So what's interesting about these kinds of cases is that widespread adherence to the norm arguably involves little cognition at all above and beyond the detection of various environmental affordances and responding appropriately. In order to participate in the relevant normative regularity, all you have to do is grasp that the runs are clear and well-groomed and that they lead to various destinations, and that doing something else is going to pose a variety of practical obstacles. The structure of the environment serves as a tacit guide towards the normatively prescribed path, whether or not you recognize it as such. In this case, a person's normative knowledge might be located entirely in the environment, right? It might be externalized and doesn't even need to be represented in the head of the norm adherent. So now turning to the third element in understanding questions about social norms would be on how social norms are maintained. And we see pluralism in this as well. So participating in normative regularities involve not just conforming to a norm, but behaving in ways that motivate others to conform to norms as well. Most of the proposals about the psychology of social norms focus on negative forms of social maintenance, such as punishment and displays of social disapproval. We already saw this in what would motivate someone to follow a norm, that they're afraid of being punished. The act of punishing is how one might socially maintain a norm when you see a violator. I'll briefly mention that, but I think that this has just been a wildly over exaggerated form of social maintenance. It's not the most important form of social maintenance, and that positive forms of social maintenance are much more important and should a lot more attention has to be paid to them. So the negative kinds of ways of socially maintaining a norm is what we look at what individuals do when someone's violated a norm. So in the philosophical tradition, of course, two major rationales for punishment are retributivism and deterrence, but there's some evidence that people in weird populations have been found to reason about punishment in a retributive manner, with specific focus on psychological factors like the perpetrator's intentions and foresight. But this pattern doesn't hold cross-culturally. In many non-weird populations, judgments about punishment are much less sensitive to intentions than they are to looking at the outcomes. You see these kind of strict liability cultures. So even when you're engaged in thinking about punishment, you're going to have different sorts of cognitive mechanisms that are going to be involved depending on whether you're interested in, what sort of punishment or what makes you think this behavior is worthy of punishment. We also see considerable individual difference in deterrence versus retributivist intuitions about punishment within cultures, and in the motivation to engage in punishment more generally. So this suggests that the disposition to punish norm violations and the psychological motivations for doing so are going to be really varied. Besides retribution and deterrence, punishment is often motivated by communicative, pedagogical intentions. When an individual transgresses a norm, an observer can use punishment to let them know their behavior is not acceptable in the hopes of shaping their future behavior, even if they're not really in a position of power where they can actually punish somebody. Like when you see a queue jumper and you're also in the queue. In these sorts of cases, punishers don't treat the act of punishment as an end into itself. Rather, they view punishment as effective only insofar as it delivers the right sort of message to the norm violator, letting them know, hey, we don't do that around here. You've got to wait in the line. We're in the line. So cognitively speaking, this form of punishment is relatively complex since it requires both punishers and violators to treat an act of punishment as a kind of Bracean communication involving a series of mentalistic inferences about communicative intentions. A less cognitively sophisticated reason that we engage in acts of punishment is to enhance our reputation in the eyes of onlookers. Punishing those who can violate group beneficial norms can serve as a costly signal of one's trustworthiness and potential cooperative partner, and thereby stabilize cooperation in the group as a whole. In line with this proposal, there's a behavioral evidence that people tend to punish more readily when they're being observed by third parties, and abstain from costly punishment when they've already had their trustworthiness to the onlookers demonstrated in some other way. So these sorts of behaviors and these decisions don't appear to be supported by conscious reflective processes, but rather they seem to be the product of unconscious heuristics to behave as the reputation is at stake, even if you're not explicitly reasoning through this at the personal level. While third-party punishment has played an important role in theories of the evolution of cooperative norms, it's also important not to overlook the role of second personal retaliatory punishment in the psychology of norms, things like revenge. Many norms regulate interpersonal interactions in a way that allow us to avoid conflicts. Again, cueing norms or norms for fairly dividing resources, property norms, norms of personal space and appropriate physical contact, things like that. Violating any of these norms can inflict direct harm or material losses on other agents who in turn have the option of just retaliating directly to the violator. Retaliation can be triggered directly by the experience of being harmed, which is like a reflective, desire for revenge or desire to lash out. Or an experience of pleasure after you've retaliated. Alternatively, the aggrieved individual might also view the sheer fact of norm violation as intrinsically motivating over and above the cause it might have harmed, right? Just like it feels really good to yell at the person who's violating the norm. And so the psychological research on this shows evidence of all of these sorts of elements involved in second party responses to violators. That's all I really want to say about negative social maintenance. I think enough has been said about this to show that there is variety in the kind of psychological mechanisms that would support it. I'm really much more interested in the positive forms of social maintenance. because they're pro-social, right? And I think that this is the way in which we really do also teach norms and the kind of pedagogical ways in which norms are acquired that I alluded to earlier when talking about norm acquisition mechanisms. Simple sorts of things where we're communicating that someone has done something right, in terms of saying good job for doing something that you think ought to have been done, is really important. It's important when we're teaching, it's important, right, when we're training students, it's important when we're raising children. All of this positive reinforcement is a way in which we are really establishing the norms of our community that we've endorsed in some way to the next generation of people who we want to adopt these sorts of norms. So we're communicating information about the value of certain actions through these sort of communicative, pedagogical, verbal constructs. And it doesn't always have to be verbal, right? It can be a literal pat on the back, right? It can be like, or a thumbs up, right? These are also ways of very explicitly communicating that this was the right way of doing things. Another way an individual can respond positively towards norm-conforming behavior would be to identify in-group members. So this, again, when you have like individuals who are dressing in a fairly uniform way because they are engaged in the same sorts of behavior. So whether this is office attire in the old days with the suit and tie, or the women's with the big shoulder pads and their suits, and you all look like you're engaged in the same task together, or the sports fans all wearing the team jersey, or when they're walking down the street wearing their team jersey, giving one another a high five even though they don't know each other and there's no game on that night. It's a in-group sort of a distinctiveness that is being promoted, and it can be make you feel good and then make you want to wear the shirt or the hat or whatever it is again the next time, because you got this positive reinforcement from the group members. A much more basic explanation of positive responses to norm conformers is that we find norm conformers predictable. So these kind of quotidian everyday norms that are so important to us gives us an easy way of being in the world. So when we're greeting somebody, I guess in Italy you shake hands. Is this how you greet people when you don't know them very well? Do you cheek kiss? Not so much. More in Spain. So in France, I know that the cheek kiss, the number of kisses varies depending on where you are, which makes it very confusing for someone like me who's visiting different areas in France, and I don't know whether it's 2 kisses or 3 kisses. Like, you might go for the 3rd kiss and miss it, or they go and you don't, and it's all very awkward. Or in the South, in the United States, colleagues would hug each other every day. Like, every day you come into work and you hug every one of your colleagues, which seems a little excessive. But if you don't hug them, then okay, you're like not being very friendly. So like, you're learning to adopt these sorts of norms, and it's just easier to go with the flow in this sort of way. So we predict. It's easy to predict what someone's going to do when you're just following the sorts of norms. And prediction error minimization models of cognition have us paying really high metabolic costs for prediction errors. And so this points to one strategy for agents to minimize prediction errors is just to seek out the more predictable social environments, the environments where other agents are largely conforming to your expectations. And this is a kind of active inference that goes on. So when agents are conforming to the social norms, this can be a sign that they won't be a source of many prediction errors. It might lead us to associate norm conformers with like positive affect, higher levels of social fluency, and less technically, it might just be that norm conformers feel nice and familiar, and we want to hang out with people who feel nice and familiar, and we know how to interact with them. It's easy and comfortable. So a different kind of positive social maintenance can also be seen in response to norm violations by in-group members, right? So not all violations result in punishments or negative reinforcement, but in some cases, in some communities, repairing is really important. acts of restorative justice are what's really important. So it can be very costly to punish groups, especially in small scale societies. You've got an individual who might be a really valuable member of that community. If you punish them, you might make them feel less willing to engage with you or help you out later. You also might risk turning them against you and then you're getting into a revenge cycle. So instead of punishment, you have practices of repair and these sorts of mutual acts of repair that can take on a kind of pedagogical flavor, where you're each teaching each other like why you did what you did and talking about what you did was, you know, what was wrong about it, what you would, how you would do differently, and so on. I think also it's important to recognize that these sorts of restorative, it's not restorative justice, but kind of pedagogical responses to violations are happening all the time when we are engaged in child rearing, right? The child who eats with their hand instead of a fork, we don't punish them, you don't send them to their room or spank them. Doing that would be ridiculous. You say, oh, it's like this. You just model the right way of doing things instead. So we have all of these hosts of positive ways of responding to norm violations as well. All right, so that's the view on the table. And the overarching argument, which I just kind of didn't explicitly state, but I think implicitly comes along, is that there are lots of cognitive mechanisms that go with all these different means. We have acquiring, conforming to, and enforcing social norms. So I'll just briefly mention two short objections and then some implications, and then we can have our discussion. I think I've gone up probably, I don't know what time it is. Oh no, we're good, right? Well, I'll wrap up. Yeah. Good. So one objection is just, oh, well, empirical pluralism could be consistent with a dedicated architecture for social norms. So maybe it isn't the case that social norm cognition isn't a natural kind, or there isn't a system for norms. And while I think that it's possible, it might be that there is a norm system. It comes with a substantial empirical price tag if we were to do that. So if we were to say that there's a norm system that exists somewhere downstream of all these various acquisition mechanisms, or upstream of other processes that contribute to norm conformity and enforcement, this kind of view would commit itself to the existence of an intervening variable in the cognitive system that right now we don't have any reason to postulate. It doesn't seem to be doing any work above and beyond the different sorts of mechanisms that I'm gesturing at in the description. So if it can be shown that there's some theoretical work that's done by this intervening variable, okay, sure. Like we haven't said that that's impossible, but at this point we think it's unlikely, and that we haven't seen a role for anything like a dedicated architecture for social norms. So we think that rather than trying to focus on a boxology of social norms, like that being the real project for psychology, the cognitive science of norm psychology, instead we should be looking at all these different kinds of cases and what are the cognitive mechanisms there, and then create a topology norm subtypes and cognitive mechanisms, and then map things out. Maybe something will fall out of it, but you know, I think, you know, it's always possible. The second objection is that norm pluralism threatens normal eliminativism. So if social norms are so heterogeneous that it can't support useful psychological generalizations, then maybe we shouldn't employ the concept of social norms in cognitive science at all. This complaint has some merit insofar as we're skeptical that there are many universal generalizations about socially normative cognition. So our proposal can be taken in part to be a deflationary one, but denying that social norms constitute a natural psychological kind don't make them any less interesting or any less amenable to psychological study. The same way as relaxing our assumptions about moral psychology hasn't made moral cognition any less worthy of study, or anyone really suggesting or taking seriously the idea that we should eliminate morality because moral psychology doesn't fit together as a natural kind. So we're not too worried about that objection either. And just to mention a couple of implications in closing. So when we've got this kind of construct on the table of a normative regularity that doesn't presuppose any sort of psychological mechanism for social norms, it opens up the door to asking questions about social norms, social normativity in places where it hasn't typically been studied, in cases like, for example, in non-human animals. And not just in non-human animals that are sophisticated, cognitively sophisticated, or thought to be, you know, one of the fancy animals like chimpanzees or dolphins or corvids that might have shared intentionality or cooperation or theory of mind. But it really allows us to investigate social norms in lots of species, including eusocial insects like ants and bumblebees. It allows us to investigate social norms in non-animals as well. I mean, we can ask questions about AI systems, were AI systems to ever form a community. It could allow us to investigate this in plants as well, right? Is this a construct that makes sense in these other places? The norm pluralism, I think, very importantly, and I'll say more about the animal social norms tomorrow and the next day. There are also implications for norm change. So a lot of the work in the cognitive science of social norms is interested in what are the mechanisms, because if we know what the mechanisms are, then we can intervene in order to change people's behavior when their behavior is problematic and supported by social norms. So things like open defecation or female genital cutting are behaviors that are problematic but supported by social norms. How do we change this? And I think that the sorts of work that we've done here to lay out the fact that norm psychology is pluralistic allows us to ask these questions in a more specific and helpful way. We can, what are the psychological mechanisms that are supporting in this community this particular social norm, instead of assuming that there is one norm psychology that's supporting norms in general and that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to norm change. I'm also going to say some things tomorrow about norm change in non-human animals, right? So there's conflicts that we have between humans and non-human animals, like elephants raiding fruit gardens and those sorts of things, that if we think about them in terms of norms and norm change, we might have a different model of creating interventions that would be more effective in these sorts of cases. And the third implication would be for normative education. So as we are trying to teach our children how to become members of society who are following the sorts of norms that we hold to be valuable, we recognize that there are lots of different ways of creating norm change, and that supporting and following norms is not the kind of psychology behind it is not something that's also going to be a one-size-fits-all. That different humans will pick up norms differently if they're communicated differently or presented them differently. It will help us show that different ways of teaching norms might be more effective for different people or different populations. So that's a third implication. And I'll stop with that, and thank you for your attention. And again, thank Evan Westra for his work on this project.
Thank you very much, Kristin.